Hello, I'm Jimmy Ivory from Virginia Tech. I want to thank you for taking time to hear this presentation out. I want to thank the other panelists and especially Dr. Ferguson for organizing it and for sharing this video. I apologize that I'm not able to be there in person. I certainly wish that I were. I'd really like to be in Paris right now with you, although my filthy office here is also very nice. I happen to be on a search committee for a college dean here, and the semifinalist interviews were rescheduled such that I was unable to attend the conference. I apologize. I'll try to be brief so that you can enjoy the in-person interaction with the other panelists. What I want to do is talk about an idea that I think kind of sells itself, or basically a very simple format of looking at bodies of literature. And specifically, I want to share an example from some research that we've done here that I was only involved in kind of a small way, and some of your other panelists were involved in as well, as sort of an example of I think, a way to assess bodies of literature that I think I don't really have to sell you. I think it sells itself, to be honest. But we'll start by talking a little bit about what we've done with specifically with virtual reality, and then I think how it can be applied to video games and other research. Specifically, I think that with some really very simple series of just a few tests, there are ways to examine entire bodies of literature that in some ways sidestep the challenges associated with challenging individual studies. I think sometimes examining the validity of individual studies is valuable, but it can be elusive. Sometimes there are a lot of unknowns about the validity of an individual study, even when there are question marks. And I think it can also be very adversarial to challenge individual studies. I think there's definitely great value to looking at kind of large bodies of literature for patterns that should be there, or maybe patterns that should not be there. A good example is that there's already existing a lot of research on, for example, patterns that show this suggestion that there might be publication bias. I can show you here some very simple examples of, I think, very easy ways that we should use more to find other systematic patterns that might be unlikely to occur without systematic problems. In other words, ways to look at entire bodies of literature to identify trends that might make us question the validity of that literature, again, without necessarily zeroing in on specific studies. And that gives us a chance, again, I think, to reflect on the validity of literature, the validity of knowledge in an area, without necessarily having to prove that a particular study is flawed or debate it. And again, an example I want to share with you that we've done more extensive research on before we talk about video games is virtual reality. There's obviously a lot of excitement about virtual reality and other related technologies, and no small amount of research on behavioral effects, you know, classic sort of two-condition experiments, correlational studies, and kind of went into the question of, is it good, led by a former master's student here called Madison Lanier, who was really kind of leading the charge on this research, along with people who have helped out since, like Dr. Shabilsky, Dr. Elson, and others. This particular project that I want to share with you, again, kind of is more of an example, I think, of how easy it is to do this with bodies of literature. We looked at a couple of databases. I'm from communication and media research, so basically looked at a large psychology and communication and media databases with some search terms that were meant to identify basically behavioral research with VR. A number of articles were identified, and a much smaller group were identified as relevant. I go into more detail with that if you're curious. But despite that relatively small number of articles, we found a lot of statistical tests to look at. And really all we looked at, again, I think this is very simple, and I'm hoping that the idea kind of sells itself, that we should do this with a lot more bodies of literature. We looked at basically how much power is there, how are the p-values distributed, how often do reporting errors occur, and how often are materials available. So again, just really looking at four things that, as you'll see here in a minute, are very simple to look at. And I think what we found is illustrative of how easy it is to find issues or problems with research that might make us question how we do it, without, again, necessarily needing large-scale replications of a lot of studies, challenges of existing studies. Just sort of a very quick overall look at the literature can sometimes tell us when there are patterns that shouldn't be there. In our case, for example, we found that in this VR research, the mean participants per condition, so to speak, although I want to mention that includes correlational studies. So basically the mean participants per condition in studies that had conditions. In studies that were correlated with only one condition, so to speak, that would include all of them, the mean participants was only 33.65. The median was much lower at 25. If you look at the figure down in the lower left, the most common number of participants was very low. And that power, according to classic measures like Cohen, is only adequate for what we call large effect sizes, which are rarely seen in this kind of research. This is also including our analyses pretty much ignored covariates, in which case the power would be much lower. We basically didn't take them into account very well. So it was a very forgiving analysis. And when we looked at between or mixed subject designs, you can see on the right, those are the box plots to the left and right, the means and medians are actually even lower. So for designs or basically experiments, things like that, means are lower. And basically, this is suggestive, as we'll see more in a minute here, of a pattern of research that's not particularly likely to find the effects that they're looking for, and in retrospect, not particularly likely to have even found the effects that it often finds, so to speak. To move on to the next thing, we looked at distribution of p-values. I wouldn't say this was nearly so conclusive. I think I have a lot to learn here. All of us did, and I think maybe the whole sort of field and the area of metascience have more to learn about how to approach this. But visually analyzing the p-curve, in other words, the distribution of p-values for significant test results, and especially specific significant test results once you take out some of the redundant ones, suggests a little bit of a peak closer to 0.05 than the normal distribution that you would see of p-values in a normally occurring range of significant findings. In other words, there's at least a little bit of suggestive evidence that there are a few too many p-values just under the significance threshold, which suggests maybe an unnatural pattern in how they're observed. I think this p-curve is problematic in some ways because the p-curve assumes adequate power, which we just found out does not exist, and the visual analysis is less than conclusive. But I wanted to mention again, we have just from a couple of very simple analyses, basically overall average of sort of an inadequately powered literature, and then maybe a disproportionate likelihood of just barely significant p-values. We also looked at reporting errors using our package stat check, which is a extremely valuable resource for anybody who hasn't used it. It flagged about 15%, 16% of the significance tests that it observed as inconsistent. In other words, the p-value reported was not consistent with degrees of freedom and the test result and things like that. Although it's known that stat check might produce false positives, so don't take that number extremely seriously. That said, about 2% of tests were what we call grossly inconsistent. In other words, they straddled the p-value 0.05. In other words, a test where everything but the p-value suggests a p-value of over 0.05, but a p-value of under 0.05 is reported by accident. And maybe less by accident, all of these errors were towards significant. In other words, test results that would suggest a non-significant p-value, but a reported significant p-value. So what you might call very fortunate errors. Even though that's only 2%, that's distributed across, again, across 61 articles. So it'd be more than 2% of the articles at least have one grossly inconsistent finding. And again, they all tend to favor significance. While we're at it, again, we see this pattern where we have an underpowered body of literature, finding too many significant findings, perhaps finding too many just barely significant findings, and errors that are not extremely prevalent, but maybe more prevalent than we should see given the very deliberative approach to science that we encourage, and errors that tend to favor significance. Lastly, we looked at the interest in like open science and data sharing, basically a very small number, less than 5%, a little over 3% of articles referenced supplementary data at all. So that's a chance to catch these kinds of mistakes and problems that is not being taken advantage of enough. So again, I know I've kind of tried to go through that pretty quickly, but basically just by looking at a few very small things, we find a pattern where we have, in a very interesting area of research, we have an underpowered body of studies that's finding phenomena despite being consistently not powerful enough to find those phenomena. And then a couple other suggestions that maybe errors in reporting rates, maybe the way that p-values are produced in analyses might be problematic as well. Again, I think this approach is useful because it points at questions about a body of literature without necessarily requiring replication or intensive challenges to any given study. Another maybe simpler way to interpret this finding from, again, what I consider sort of a very simple set of analyses is that even assuming that the phenomena under study are happening, that these so-called effects that these studies are observing in VR are happening, on average, the studies aren't powerful enough to find them, even assuming that those phenomena are happening. So we're finding them too much, even again, assuming that they're there. And we're finding them more than we should. And I think that that's problematic in a number of ways, right? I think that after very quickly kind of going over that test example of VR, we don't yet have a lot of data about video game research. I think one problem would be trying to choose which areas of video game research to explore. But again, I think even with, for example, a very simple set of studies about the same 4 criteria, we could learn a lot more about the validity of video game effects research. And I think after having been involved in this area for a few years, I think this sort of approach might be sort of kind of politically and within the culture of research valuable, in that it does look at large bodies of research, but doesn't necessarily challenge individual studies. I find that this area is particularly contentious. I find that researchers in this area have developed a lot of acrimony for each other at often a very personal level. And it may be that taking a step back and just looking at sort of the broad sea movement of a large body of studies rather than challenging individual studies might cool it off while also being insightful. So, and my anecdotal observation is that we have some of the same patterns. Our studies are in this area of, like, say, video games and aggression are too small to be consistently finding what they find as often as they have, and that maybe looking at that overall would be a nice way to look at whether we want to continue the same methodological patterns or try to make some changes. I don't have real conclusive results with regard to video games. Based on that test case, that proof of concept case of VR, I would like to see us do really very simple sort of research on this, and that might inform the state of our literature, again, without maybe necessarily overheating this sort of already very heated up area. If anybody there would like to do this kind of research with video games, I'd be very interested in doing it with you, or continuing to do it with you, as we're just barely getting started. Again, I think these kind of big broad patterns of what do we know in general, aside from telling us about the state of the literature without necessarily challenging specific studies, they might give us a little bit of a fresh start. If the validity pattern in this research is problematic, I think we can stop throwing good data after bad. In other words, stop designing the same studies over and over again, and get a little bit of a fresh start. Not necessarily, again, challenging individual studies, but saying if in video games, as for example in VR, we are designing research that's unlikely to find the effects that it's finding, even if those effects are there, then that suggests we have other problems, and some of those problems, unfortunately, are thumb on the scale types of problems, and that we need to improve our approaches. I think this is the case with a lot of behavioral research. I think this is the case with a lot of media research. I think this is the case with video game research. I'd like to see more data produced in it. And again, I hope that sort of anecdotal example of virtual reality suggests that this very sort of easy approach might be valuable. I do think we have to take a good look and improve it, because it's not going to prove itself. I do want to share one finding that I held back from that VR study, is that despite the average power being a little bit too low to find even the findings that were being observed consistently, that power actually had a slight but significant correlation with time that was inverse. In other words, the power of those studies actually decreased over time, not increased. I think we'll see the same in other areas. So just, again, I think, I don't know that you had to listen to me much. I think the idea sells itself. With a very simple set of analyses, we can look at a body of literature and see if the patterns are suggesting that it's even capable of finding what it's finding. And if not, I think we need to take another look at what we're finding and how, and how we can maybe produce findings that we're more likely to feel good about. If all has gone well, I'm meant to be available to talk with you via Skype if the internet connection there is not good. I hope that the video hasn't been too boring. Again, I apologize that I couldn't join you in France. I was stuck here with other work, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the panelists. Thank you. I appreciate it.